In recent years, millions of people across dozens of democracies have begun voting for leaders who promise to bypass traditional legislative processes. They elect candidates who openly mock democratic norms, who pledge to cut through the red tape of constitutional constraints, who promise swift action over deliberative governance. The voters who choose these leaders are not ignorant, they are exhausted. Plato predicted this exact psychological moment 2,400 years ago. The philosopher from Athens watched his own democracy crumble and identified the precise stages that free people pass through before they beg for a master. He discovered that democracies do not die from external conquest. They elect their own executioners through a predictable pattern of mass psychology that repeats across civilizations like a genetic code. The pattern begins when citizens become overwhelmed by the burden of infinite choice. They grow exhausted by the responsibility of self-governance. They start to crave the simplicity of having someone else decide for them. Then they encounter a figure who promises to shoulder that burden, and they hand over their freedom with relief and gratitude. What makes this terrifying is how good it feels to the people. The surrender of democratic responsibility produces genuine psychological pleasure. People experience profound relief when they stop having to think for themselves. They feel liberated by their own enslavement. This video will show you the psychological stages that every democracy passes through on its way to tyranny. You will see how these stages are unfolding in real time across Western nations today. You will learn to recognize the specific moment when democratic citizens begin their unconscious search for a master, and how to resist that search within yourself. The democracy you live in today is exhibiting every symptom Plato identified as terminal. The question is whether you will recognize the diagnosis in time to save yourself. The man who saw tomorrow. Plato was a traumatized witness to the collapse of his own democracy. Born into aristocratic Athens at the height of its power, he watched his state destroy itself through the very freedoms that had made it great. The young Plato witnessed Athens execute Socrates, his teacher and the wisest man he knew, through a democratic vote. He watched as his fellow citizens, exhausted by war and political chaos, handed power to the 30 tyrants who promised to restore order to democratic confusion. His cousin Critias became the most ruthless leader of the 30 tyrants. His uncle Charmides helped govern during the oligarchy. Plato lived through the complete cycle from democracy to tyranny in real time, observing every psychological stage from the inside. In the Republic, written around 380 BCE, Plato was documenting the precise psychological mechanisms through which free people choose their own enslavement. He was creating a field guide for recognizing democratic collapse while it was happening. When you read Plato's warnings about democracy electing tyrants, you are reading the testimony of someone who watched it happen to people exactly like you. The restless soul of democracy. The person living in a mature democracy faces a problem that would have seemed absurd to their ancestors: too much freedom. They wake up each morning confronted by an infinite menu of choices: what to eat, what to wear, what to believe, what to buy, whom to love, how to work, where to live. This abundance of choice creates what Plato observed as psychological exhaustion. The mind, overwhelmed by endless possibilities, begins to fragment. People develop what Plato described as a motley character, a personality that shifts constantly because it cannot settle on any single organizing principle. Watch someone scrolling through streaming services for 20 minutes, unable to choose what to watch. Observe the anxiety in their face as they swipe through dating apps, paralyzed by infinite romantic possibilities. This is the democratic soul in action, free to choose everything, capable of choosing nothing with conviction. The democratic person, according to Plato's analysis in the Republic, lives from day to day indulging the appetite of the hour, and sometimes he is lapped in drink and strains of the flute. Then he becomes a water drinker and tries to get thin. Then he takes a turn at gymnastics, sometimes idling and neglecting everything, then once more living the life of a philosopher. This restless shifting between identities creates a deep inner hunger, not for more choices, but for someone to end the choosing. The democratic soul secretly longs for the relief of having decisions made for them. They begin to fantasize about leaders who possess absolute certainty, who never doubt, who cut through complexity with simple answers. Here lies the fatal weakness that tyrants exploit. Democratic citizens, exhausted by their own freedom, become susceptible to anyone who promises to think for them. For 1 week, limit yourself to 3 choices in any category where you normally face too many options. Notice the relief you feel when choice is constrained. Observe how this relief might make you vulnerable to someone who promises to eliminate choice entirely. The tyrant's garden. The moment democratic citizens become exhausted by choice, they create perfect conditions for tyranny to take root. The person overwhelmed by infinite possibilities begins to crave the opposite: singular, unwavering certainty delivered by a singular, unwavering leader. Citizens start to complain that democracy is too messy, too slow, too complicated. They begin to admire leaders in other countries who get things done without constitutional constraints. They fantasize about someone who could cut through all the noise and simply decide. Plato identified this as the crucial turning point. Democratic societies begin to produce a specific type of leader who feeds on this collective exhaustion. These figures arise not despite democracy, but because of it. They are democracy's own creation, antibodies produced by a system trying to cure itself of its own freedom. The proto-tyrant appears as a problem solver. They promise to restore order to chaos, to replace endless debate with decisive action. They speak to the secret relief that democratic citizens feel when someone else takes responsibility for difficult decisions. What makes this seductive is that the proto-tyrant often delivers on their promises, at least initially. They do solve problems quickly. They do cut through bureaucratic delays. Citizens experience genuine relief as their burden of self-governance lifts from their shoulders. Plato observed that people welcomed their tyrants with celebrations. They cheered as their freedoms were systematically removed because each removal felt like liberation from responsibility. They applauded the elimination of political opposition because it meant an end to confusing choices. The tyrant succeeds by promising to be the ultimate parent to a population that has grown tired of being adults. But here lies Plato's most crucial insight. The tyrant who promises to solve the problem of choice ends up making every choice for everyone. Notice when you feel drawn to leaders who promise simple solutions to complex problems. This attraction to certainty over freedom is the psychological doorway through which tyrants enter democratic societies. The Great Inversion. The strangest aspect of democratic collapse is how willingly citizens participate in their own subjugation. They do not resist the erosion of their freedoms. They celebrate it. They cheer as their rights disappear because each disappearance feels like the solution to a problem they no longer wanted to solve themselves. Plato called this the Great Inversion, the moment when equality transforms into its opposite through the desires of equal citizens themselves. People who once insisted on being treated as equals begin to crave hierarchy, structure, and someone to tell them what to do. Democratic citizens, exhausted by the responsibility of self-governance, begin to resent other citizens who seem to handle that responsibility better. The resentment builds until equality itself becomes unbearable. Citizens start to believe that some people deserve more power than others, specifically the people who promise to use that power on their behalf. People discover that being ruled feels easier than ruling themselves. They find that following orders requires less energy than making decisions. This surrender happens gradually through small compromises. Citizens accept minor restrictions on speech because they eliminate the stress of hearing opposing viewpoints. They welcome surveillance because it provides security without requiring them to secure themselves. Each compromise feels rational in isolation. Citizens tell themselves they are making practical trade-offs between freedom and security. They do not realize they are trading their humanity for the comfort of being livestock. The Great Inversion completes when former equals begin to compete not for more freedom, but for closer proximity to power. They seek to become the tyrant's favorites, to earn special protection through loyalty and submission. Pay attention to moments when you feel relief at having decisions made for you by authorities. These feelings of relief are the psychological foundation upon which tyrannies are built. The philosopher's immunity. While democratic citizens surrender their souls to would-be tyrants, a small minority remains mysteriously immune to the seduction. Plato called these people philosophers, not because they study philosophy professionally, but because they maintain the habit of thinking for themselves, even when everyone around them has stopped. The philosopher possesses psychological sovereignty. They have cultivated the capacity to remain internally free, regardless of external circumstances. They do not need others to think for them because they have never stopped thinking for themselves. The philosopher regularly questions their own assumptions, desires, and reactions. When the proto-tyrant appears promising simple solutions, the philosopher asks, "What assumptions does this solution require me to accept?" When citizens around them begin to crave certainty, the philosopher asks, "What am I trying to avoid by wanting certainty?" Plato believed that this self-questioning habit immunizes people against the psychological mechanisms that tyrants exploit. The philosopher cannot be seduced by promises of certainty because they have accepted uncertainty as the human condition. They cannot be manipulated through their desires because they understand their desires as psychological phenomena rather than absolute truths. The philosopher remains free not by fighting external tyrants, but by refusing to become an internal tyrant to themselves. They do not try to eliminate their own contradictions and uncertainties, the very things that tyrants promise to eliminate for others. The philosopher's immunity spreads through example rather than argument. When others observe someone maintaining their psychological sovereignty during collective surrender, they remember that such sovereignty is possible. Develop the daily practice of questioning your own certainties. When you find yourself absolutely convinced of something, ask what evidence might challenge that conviction. This habit of self-examination builds the psychological muscle that resists external control. The eternal return. The cycle Plato identified has repeated itself across every civilization that has ever attempted democratic governance. Each generation believes their democracy is different, more sophisticated than those that came before. Each generation discovers the same psychological laws operating within their own citizens. Every person living in a democratic society faces the same fundamental choice that faced the citizens of ancient Athens: to think for themselves or to have others think for them. This choice presents itself daily in small moments that accumulate into the trajectory of an entire civilization. The person who chooses to think for themselves becomes part of the minority that keeps the possibility of freedom alive, even when freedom itself becomes unpopular. but the person who chooses to let others think for them becomes part of the eternal cycle of democratic collapse. The cycle will complete itself regardless of individual choices. Democracies will continue to elect their own destroyers because the psychological laws that govern this process are as reliable as the laws of physics. But within this inevitable cycle, each person still faces their individual choice: to remain conscious or to go to sleep, to think or to be thought for. The democracy you live in today will follow the same path as every democracy before it. The only question is whether you will follow that path yourself, or whether you will choose the more difficult road of thinking for yourself while everyone around you stops thinking. Your choice will not save democracy, but it will save the possibility of democracy for those who come after. And in the end, that might be the only kind of salvation that human beings can offer each other.